Welcome to our first podcast of Goa Dialogues, produced by the International Centre Goa, or ICG as we are known as. I'm your host Pushkar, and I have with me Siddharth Pandey, who's currently spending a month as a scholar in residence working on his book A Town So Loved, Shimla, the Chhota Vilayat of Indian Himalayas. ICG's residency program is for those writers who are working on a substantial book, and over the last 6 years, we have selected 15 writers from across the country, and they have so far published 7 books. You can read more about the program on our website, internationalcentregoa.com. Siddharth, welcome to the very first episode of ICG's Goa Dialogues podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pushkar. Thank you.
Let me begin with a quick introduction. Siddharth Pandey is a writer, literary scholar, cultural historian, curator, photographer, and musician based in Shimla. He holds a PhD in English and Materiality Studies from the University of Cambridge. His doctoral thesis was on children's fantasy literature, but he has a parallel interest in the evolving cultural and aesthetic politics of Shimla in particular and Himachal Pradesh more broadly. Siddharth has been the recipient of several scholarships and fellowships, including a Cambridge Commonwealth Shared Scholarship and a Cambridge International Scholarship, and he has held postdoctoral fellowships at Yale University and the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Siddharth has written and researched on a wide range of topics in peer-reviewed journals, academic anthologies, and several South Asian newspapers. His first book, Fossil, published in 2021, is a collection of poems, and it was a finalist for the Banff Mountain Book Awards in 2022. Siddharth's landscape and architecture photographs have featured in solo and thematic exhibitions in India and the UK, including at the Victoria and Albert Museum at London. What we're going to do is I have a series of questions for Siddharth, and there'll be some follow-up questions in between maybe, but otherwise we'll just continue at one stretch. Siddharth, once again, welcome to the podcast. And let me begin by asking a very straightforward question. The book you're currently working on is a history of Shimla, a cultural history, I believe. How did this book happen to come about?
Thank you once again to everyone at the ICG and especially to you, Pushkar, for having me here. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege being here for the last 3.5 weeks. And I'm looking forward to the final week as well. As for the book that I'm working on, for which I have this residency, I'm from Himachal, Himalayas, and I grew up there, did most of my studies there, except for 5 years in Dehradun, which was also well in the Himalayas. I grew up in the Kulu Valley, where my father was based in the Indian Forest Service. And it wasn't in Shimla that I grew up or even got educated. So even though I say that I am from Shimla, it's a kind of a relationship, an appellation that I have decided for myself because I've fallen in love.
Sort of an adopted home.
Absolutely an adopted home. I don't even say an adopted home, just a home actually now. But yeah, absolutely. So my father was working in the Kulu Valley, and in the last 10 years of his services in the Indian Forest Service, he shifted to Shimla. And that's where I found this absolutely magical place for the first time in huge detail, which was so different from many other places in Himachal that I had been visiting or living in. And the one key difference was that while Kulu Valley and most other pre-colonial places in Shimla, in Himachal and Himalayas at large, are set in the valleys, so you're literally along the river. In the case of Shimla, and as you would know in other hill stations as well, whether Darjeeling or Mussoorie or Nainital, the topography is literally up on the ridge and along the mountains. And I think that sense and that effect of just living along the ridge was something so powerful. The skies opened up, and then Shimla had its own extremely rich history, both political history and leisure history. It served as the summer capital of British India from 1864 to 1947. It also served as the summer capital of undivided Punjab, as well as for 3 years the capital of the government of exile of Burma during the Second World War. And so while the political history was important, the leisure history was also very important, because all of these hill stations were made in order to escape the proverbial heat and dust of the plains. And for more than 6 months, 6 to 8 months, the government of the empire would work from Shimla And the parallel governments, the provincial governments, would also shift to different hill stations. So in Uti and Mahabaleshwar and Darjeeling and all. I think so. Of course, the first thing that impressed me and that caught my attention about Shimla was just a very, very rich history. Almost every single British or another European or American who visited this place during the course of the 19th century
And just about everyone visited there.
everyone visited it. I mean, you did need to have actually quite a lot of money as well, because it was a place for the rich, to be honest. And at one point in history, it was the most taxed place as well in colonial India. So you did need to have that kind of capital with you. But once you were there, I mean, people couldn't resist themselves from writing. So that recorded part, that written part of a colonial place in Himachal was something that caught my attention because I have my background in English literature and we study texts, as you know. But I think what also caught my attention was the post 1947 part. So what has happened till now in the histories, in most of the histories of hill stations, and especially with Shimla, is that the attention is largely devoted to the period until 1947. And fair enough, because we have a lot of written documents until then. But when I came to live there, I realized that it's not only, the heritage, the colonial heritage that I'm inhabiting. I'm also inhabiting another temporality, which is the post 1947 to 2021. And it's in that phase that a place like Shimla becomes, earlier it was Simla, now it is Shimla. So it's in that phase that it actually becomes from Simla to Shimla, a post-colonial place. But the most interesting part, I think, for me was how very well loved this place was. Hence the title of my book, A Town So Loved. And I think love and affection and enchantment and wonder are things that we don't usually talk about. Academia is hush-hush about these issues. We tend to prioritize things like crisis or, any kind of, so to say, the serious issues where these ideas of aesthetics and beauty and love are somehow considered to be less of of a significant issue. But I realized that if there was one thing that was binding the whole town together, it was this intense love for the town. And this was a bit confusing at first as well, because this was a place that was the heart and the symbol of empire and control and subordination until 1947. So how could it translate into a place that became intensely cherished by common people and by visitors alike, across castes, across classes as well? In fact, one historian, Pamela Cover, who's written this brilliant academic history of Simla, Imperial Simla until 1947, she says even she's confounded in the introduction as to this, what she calls a convoluted nostalgia of all Indians towards Simla, even during the British times.
Everybody in North India has been to Shimla.
Has been to Shimla.
Even though there are competing hill stations.
Absolutely. So I think that term convoluted nostalgia just struck me, because I think that nostalgia is something which it's considered to be a kind of a wrong emotion or an insignificant emotion. But the more I researched it, the more I realized that there is a lot to be spoken about the adaptation of a colonial town into a post-colonial town. And therefore, this book is becoming not only a cultural history of Shimla, but a history of emotions, of relating to a place. How do you emote towards a place or relate towards a place in terms of joy, in terms of pleasure, and of course in terms of crisis as well. I mean, Shimla and many other hill stations are just going downhill because of the haphazard development and all, as we all know. But that exploration of joy and wonder remains central to my quest. And the kind of markers that I'm working with are, I'm thinking of history in relationship to geography, and thinking of aesthetics in relationship to politics. And I'm thinking of the real, everyday, lived aspects of Shimla in relationship to imagination and fantasy. Because as we know, most of the Bollywood films, whenever they would, either they would go to, Kashmir,
Right.
after color came in,
Yeah.
in 1960s and 70s, Kashmir and then Simla. So living there as a resident and now going back, as a tourist and all, it's always enchanting for me to think about this sort of duality of reality and imagination, or say fantasy and reality, that propels the shaping of Shimla as an otherworldly place. So even when people are living there, they tend to call it a fairy tale town, while being absolutely invested in the day-to-day mundane activities of going on. And it's this sort of a duality that I want to understand. How does a place become a wondrous place and an enchanted place and an Indian place from a very British place?
No, so even as we are, talking about how this book has come to be written, still being written, I immediately thought that one angle, and we had discussed some of these things earlier in the past couple of weeks. The one thing that came to mind is that this is also a biography of a city. Right?
Absolutely.
And, I mean, as somebody who read a bit on urbanization and cities and such, two books, for example, on Brazil that immediately come to mind is Teresa Caldera's anthropological study of Sao Paulo. It was on, City of Walls.
Yeah.
How, how that all happened. Big fat book. And also James Holston's biography or study of Brasilia.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
on India, I mean, can you think of others who have written biographies of cities you could relate to? I mean, in recent years in particular.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots and lots of them, right? And especially from, say, travel literature or popular travel literature. Everybody talks about City of Gins by William Dalrymple. Or, I remember one book that made a huge impression on me long time back was Butter Chicken in Ludhiana by Pankaj Mishra, which is a travel, not focusing exactly on one city, but it was still sort of, working on. And then city literature and urban literature is very much a defined genre in itself. One of my other favorite books is by Amit Chaudhary. I'm forgetting the name of it, but he has written, I think, 2 Years in Calcutta, something like that it's called. And it's very, very felt and, deeply emotional and as well as political in some ways, understanding of the city. And then, of course, the best work in city literature till now, at least in India, is considered to be Sukhdev Mehta's Maximum City, which is an absolutely brilliant and must read. I still remember one reviewer calling it what Dickens does for London, Sukhdev Mehta does for Bombay. One of my friends, Mihir Watts, has this beautiful book called Tales of Hazaribagh, which is about a small settlement where you also have a connection with Hazaribagh. And so about that. So I think there is a lot of work now being written on place and travel. And these are very much my reference points as well. And not only in India, but also, like you talked about Brazil, in Europe, you have many of them. So all of these are there. But I think the book would definitely fall within the urban literature category, but in some ways it's also inspired by the category of, say, nature writing or place writing, which is not exactly city literature.
Sometimes you wonder, why do we have to categorize at all? But I come from a different discipline as somebody who's done social sciences. So I can immediately think of, urbanization, urban challenges, transport, and poverty or health and education and all those things.
Absolutely.
Right. The second question I have really is that, your past work has been, your PhD was on children's fantasy literature. And, we talked about Fossils, your collection of poems. Now, your PhD dissertation and your collection of poetry and now Shimla. I mean, can you, just talk a little bit about how you have gone into these seemingly different areas? I mean, for me,
no.
different
I mean,
ways.
definitely. I mean, on the first go and at the first sight, they are very, very different. And this is a kind of a challenge I had to deal with in my student years and university years as well. I remember we had shifted to Shimla in 2010. But like most children of my generation, I was incredibly enthralled by the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling. And I was a kind of an avid reader before that as well. But like Potter was something which just did the magic for me, like many other children. And I remember just sort of deciding that I want to do something on fantasy literature. What exactly I didn't know, but something I wanted to do. And then we shifted to Shimla in 2010 when I, went from my MA to my first MPhil in Delhi University. And I realized that in the Indian academia then, there was hardly a scope for studying children's or fantasy literature. You could do it in bits and parts. So some people were, say, studying Bengali children's literature or, say, the other, traditional, the folk children's literature and all. But it was still very much a kind of a marginalized subject. And upon research on the internet, I found that there are whole centers for children's literature located outside the country, in Europe, in America, either under the faculties of education or sociology or as independent centers itself. So I decided that I'll write my first MPhil thesis on Shimla in India, but for my higher education, that was also higher education, but for my other degrees beyond that, I would go back to fantasy literature and just wanted to understand the making of magic, as it were. What is it that goes into the making of magic? Everything from landscape to materiality to everything. Now, I still remember the number of scholarship interviews that I had, especially in India. And this was always the first question. They knew about my work in Shimla. They were like, why are you, going and transitioning to something like that? And also, to be honest, Pushkar, there is a kind of a hierarchy within the humanities as well. So, in terms of the choosing of the subject. So, if I had said that I'm from Shimla, I'm going to study Shakespeare, no one would have, batted an eyelid. But because it was
The post-colonial writing really,
yeah,
come at the top.
it does very much so. Absolutely, it does.
This is just the
No,
way
it does. And I could have carried it on, but to be honest, I had a fantastic supervisor in Delhi University, Professor Uday Kumar, who then joined JNU, and it was under his guidance that I wrote my thesis on Shimla. But I think he empowered me so much with whatever I had to learn in the context of writing about cities and all, that I felt confident enough to carry on this project on myself. But I still needed some sort of an educational background in the subject I wanted to study for my PhD. And then I applied to Cambridge and got scholarship and all, and ended up doing my second MPhil and my PhD in children's literature, especially fantasy literature, which I call it, the bio note calls it children's fantasy literature, but fantasy essentially is a crossover genre. So Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings not for children, but it's read by across people, but he wrote The Hobbit for children. So it's and even Harry Potter and Philip Pullman and all of these people have both adult and child readerships. But to my mind, none of this, in fact, anything that I do has never seemed, different or necessarily distinct in an unrelated sort of a way. Everything has always spoken to my imagination as well as my scholarly capacities. And the quickest answer is that, regarding my Shimla work and my fantasy work, is that Shimla was the biggest fantasy of the British. It was made as a fantasy town. It was made as a place away from what they call the real India. It was made as a home away from home. I still remember that one of the first times I saw the Viceregal Lodge, which is now the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, on the beautiful observatory hill in Shimla. The first thing I saw it and I was like, this is Hogwarts, and that was my mind. So even to understand a sort of a real place, I was using metaphors and my knowledge of children's literature and fantasy, And the other relationship is also that no fantasy world, no matter how imaginative and how, completely beyond the realms of this world, is always invariably located in a landscape. The idea of a land is central to any fantasy world. So you have Wonderland in Alice in Wonderland, and you have the Middle Earth in Tolkien, and you have so many, but you cannot ever take away a landscape from, because that's what provides the material, genesis to it. But what does happen in fantasy is that more than, say, realistic literature, is that the non-human aspects of those magical worlds attain a much greater and obvious sentience than you would have in a realist piece, than you would have, say, in a Jane Austen or an Amitav Ghosh, in the realist tradition and all. So I think that's what pulled me towards it. How is it that objects and landscape is literally speaking or acting on its own volition, But in a kind of a metaphorical or an experiential sort of way, this is something that I also found in my life in the Himalayas. I often go back to the lines that we often, all of us, use in order to demonstrate our allegiance to a place. So I belong to Shimla. What does that eventually mean? It doesn't mean that I have a claim on Shimla. It means that Shimla has a claim on me. You belong to something. And once you live in the mountains, or for that matter, even by the sea here, there is a way in which the natural landscape pulls you and shapes your sensibility, not only necessarily in aesthetic terms, but also in political terms and also in experiential everyday terms. that becomes a part of your identity. And I think I was seeing the same thing happening in fantasy literature at a much sort of a, broader sort of a level. So that sense of sentience and aliveness of landscape is something that connects both of my interests. And coming to this book, Fossil, which is effectively my first book, this came as a result of a very large global arts project called the Lost Rocks Project, which also have the cover, the name. And this is a project that was run by these artist couple, Margaret and Justy, who reside in Tasmania actually, and whom I met in Yale during my second postdoctoral research fellowship. And to be honest, I did not understand what the project was entirely about, but they were trying to create a kind of a large library of what they called rocks, minerals, metals. And they were trying to, usher or inaugurate a certain dialogue around the metals and the minerals and the rocks that form our very earth. And they were inspired very much from the nature writing tradition as well. Now, in nature writing or writings about nature and landscape, if you go into a bookshop in the US or Europe, there are whole sections devoted to
It's another world.
Yeah, it's the secret life of an insect, the secret life of a plant and all. But there's relatively much less discussion on rocks because they are just inert. So the point that they were trying to make was the rationale that they were trying to forward was that rocks are not inert. They literally form the universe. And it was towards the end of 2020 that I received this invitation to write a book. All books in this series are less than 100 pages. So this would be the thickness. And I just had 2 months to write this book. And this was, I think, the first project of my life which I ended up saying yes to without even fully knowing what am I what I'm supposed to do about it. So I think it's one of those, it is literally that project where my intuition became bigger than my research, although I had to research a lot and read a lot. And eventually I ended up writing this book of like 8 long interconnected poems inspired by the Himalayas, set in the Himalayas, inspired also by my life in the Himalayas. And they kind of creatively trace the arc from the shaping or the beginning of the Himalayas to the beginning of mankind. So I literally sort of poeticized the merger of the two, the plates and all, and the formation of the Himalayas and all. But the title Fossil, I took it to be more as a metaphor than as an actual fossil. I mean, of course, the Himalayas are known for their fossils because the mountains originated from the ocean and all, as we all know. But in the mountains, you also find many of these fossils and stones being venerated as parts of Shiva or Shakti or Vishnu, Shaligrams and all of that. So that was my sort of, entry point. And I wanted to think deeply about it. And eventually, the term fossil itself became a kind of a metaphor to understand the relationship between life and death, fixity and fluidity, past, present, and future. And it's a kind of a philosophical understanding of the mountains by thinking about mythology and geology in an interconnected fashion. And here too, I think my training in fantasy literature actually helped me because you need to sort of sometimes shed your completely rational aspects and think about or imagine about the deep time of the Himalayas in very wild ways. Only then something like this is possible. So yeah, but the connection with the centrality of landscape, imagination, aesthetics remains vital to.
So you see it as part of it.
As part of everything, absolutely. Yeah.
While you're talking about, fantasy literature and Harry Potter and so on, and you mentioned 2010, that's when you were at Cambridge.
I was, 2013 I went, 2010 was,
So I remember 2013, 14 very clearly because that was the time our daughter, who was, I think, 7, 8, she started to watch Harry Potter and listen to the audio and so on. And then, later started to read as well. But, without Harry Potter and I think without Tim Burton, Charlie the Chocolate Factory, I think we watched it together several times. And that's a gory movie.
Yeah, it's a gory movie.
Yeah. So you can imagine. But there's so much space for fantasy and, and somebody might say, how come you're sitting and watching a Tim Burton movie, for example. But then, I read somewhere that kids, that's fantasy. I mean, horror, or you don't have to be afraid of horror movies. Of the important kind. As long as it's fantasy, right?
Exactly.
So you can have action, suspense, thrills, and horror on as part of the same thing.
Absolutely.
As long as somebody watching it knows that this is fantasy. Uh,
And Burton excels in combining comic approach towards life with humor, with darkness, with gothic, with fantasy. So it's a kind of a mishmash of
I think I
everything.
ended up watching a bunch of Tim Burton movies. I was never a fan. Some of his movies are fantastic, even for me. But some of them are just a bit too much. But we ended up watching a lot of them because your kid loves it, so you're going to watch it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I just want to say that fantasy, now again, I don't like categorizations and classifications, but as most literary experts argue, and I have said this for a very long time, that fantasy in the broadest sense has been the most popular form of writing literature across the world. So I mean, right from our mythologies to the Western epics, Iliads and everything by Homer and Aeneid and all that, right? To if you look at say an encyclopedia of fantasy or an encyclopedia of children's literature, and you go under the India section, they would always refer to the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and the folklores as part of. So for much of human history, talking about magic, fantasy, the unreal and the real was all part of the same sort of a
And it all
spectrum.
goes back to the land.
It all goes back.
Landscape.
Always
No, the elements.
elements,
Earth,
absolutely.
water, sun.
So these sort of distinguishing features, that this is realist and this is fantasy, this comes very, very late, just in the last 200 to 300 years. After the Enlightenment comes in, the idea of reason comes in, and then reason becomes that marker which separates our modern age from the pre-modern, that kind of a thing. But otherwise, fantasy and imagination are at the heart of our, no matter how much.
Dangerous thing to say in today's age.
Exactly, absolutely. It is very much dangerous, and therefore we have to be
the post-truth era. That
absolutely, absolutely, and therefore we have to be very, very nuanced and complex regarding what exactly we are talking about. But I'm also quite critical of when people today say, "Oh, I am completely rational," or I only believe in science and don't believe in religion. That seems to me to be a very big another kind of an extreme.
It also takes away so much from your life.
It completely takes away. No poetry, no literature can ever exist through an entirely rational mind. It's impossible.
Okay. So the next question, let me see how if I can frame it properly. Your research canvas seems to me quite vast, multidisciplinary, and along the way, and this is true for all of us in different ways, along the way there were definitely certainly individuals, even institutions, or even places where you lived, whether in school, college, university, who shaped sort of, I can say for example that, my 10 years in Delhi as a student were remarkable in so many different ways. And not just because, I made friends or, I went to this college or that college or that university. So if you had to think of people, places, institutions, doesn't have to be a very long answer, but, who shaped your thinking, your sensibilities, because some of these things that you write and research on requires a particular kind of sensibility.
It does.
So, I mean, I'm going to be honest enough to say that, it just doesn't do it for me, but the things that you work on. So, could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, you said that it could be a short of this, but the list is very long, to be honest, because
so that's why I
the list is very long, but yeah, I'll try not to sort of prolong it more than necessary. I mean, the first two teachers for me are always the Himalayas and my mother. Even I remember even in my acknowledgements for my thesis, PhD thesis, even before I thanked my PhD supervisor, the first entity that I thanked was the Himalayas. It's as simple as that for me. It's literally that I carry the landscape within, and that seems to me to be the biggest blessing I can think of. And then my mother, who has been my school teacher in English literature, that's where my interest in English came from. And also a fantastic homemaker. And for me, both of the things were very important. And a wonderful artist and a craftsperson, and just a person who has incredible zest towards life. I think I've been quite moved and enthralled and like pulled by people who just show a certain receptivity towards life, a certain attentiveness towards life. The great American nature poet Mary Oliver has that lovely line that attention is the beginning of all devotion. And similarly, Simone Weil, the French philosopher, says that attention is the biggest form of generosity. And I think all of the people whom I have been inspired by have shown a great nuanced sort of an
generosity. I have to just butt in.
Yeah.
I mean, these days, everybody, I mean, I'm sure you include in some ways that definitely that attention deficit. So
It's just
attention as generosity is such a remarkable thing to
It's a fabulous thing. I think it's a fabulous thing. You are attending to something and you are bringing a whole sensibility to that person or place or whatever it is that you're considering. And I think it was through Ma that, the notion of the extraordinary within the ordinary arose for me. So yes, I ended up studying fantasy and all, where everything was already given as a rule as extraordinary. But even to just, think about an ordinary drawing room or a lawn or the place that you are inhabiting on an everyday basis as enchanted was something that was, engendered by her. She used to always say that you need to think about, I think this is one of her favorite lines, that you need to think about connections across the sphere. Everything is connected. Later on, you read about Buddhism and the Buddha, and that's exactly what they are also saying. So that was from a very personal level. I have already talked about Professor Uday Kumar at Delhi University, my other mentor, Dr. Vinitha Chandra, who talked to me in Delhi University in Ramjas College. These two people were very, very influential in terms of their sensitivity and critical acumen, but also in having much more trust in me at many times than I had in myself. So I think you often need that sort of mentor figure who is able to, look through your future or see it when you are, not very, you don't think much about yourself. And then there are a host of critics and thinkers. So if I have to pick up one thinker who has sort of completely changed my life, it will be the British anthropologist Tim Ingold. He teaches at the University of Aberdeen. And he's widely thought of as one of the most remarkable minds of our times. And he works across disciplines. So anthropology, art, archaeology, art, you name it, and he has written something on it. But the most profound thought that he inspired me was that you need to think about the world in terms of a process and in terms of aliveness, not in terms of a finished product. And I think the more I read about, those theorizations as to how can we think about even a table like this or a mic like this, not in terms of an absolutely finished product, but something in terms of that is alive and all, just sort of opened up a whole world. Similarly, he writes beautifully about aesthetics as something quite egalitarian, not as something which is connected to elitism or taste. And in this regard, people like the Harvard critic Ellen Scurry, she has a beautiful book on beauty and justice and talks about the interrelationship between beauty and justice. Or you have the spearheader of the arts and crafts movement, William Morris, who was a socialist and an artist and a craftsperson, and again, you name it, he too was able to think about beauty and the ordinary, enchanted and the ordinary, nature and culture, everything as fused with each other. And then the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, he too has been talking about aesthetics in a very egalitarian manner. As much as I'm grateful to the academia for giving me so much, and I'm myself an academic, I keep going back to my memories of, thinking about aesthetics in a much more fertile manner, and then being confronted by people who would tell me, oh, you are being very elitist because you're talking about things like beauty and aesthetics. And clearly that was just a very narrowed and reductionist understanding, whereas in my life, whatever I've been, seeing in these through these lenses has been very important for just the understanding of society as a whole. Yeah. And towards the end, I think some writers from India, the Indian novelist Anuradha Roy, one of my favorite novels of hers is The Folded Earth, and she has this lovely line, some people carry the mountains in them, while some carry the sea. And she's also an artist and a potter and a writer. Then there is the Indian social commentator Santosh Desai, whose articles I've been reading for the last 20 Times of India. And as much as I I'm very critical of the paper itself. I think his writings have always carried a certain sort of an originality and versatility. He can write about politics and about things and about everything. So I think it was through his writings that I actually started thinking about the interdisciplinarity of world in a kind of critical fashion. And then we have two of my very dear friends and inspirations, and possibly the best nature writers of our times. One is Professor Robert Macfarlane, who teaches in Cambridge, and who was also my PhD examiner. And another is Yuvan Abbas. He is a South Indian naturalist and an educator. And again, in their works, both of them are fantastic educators and have written and taught many people. But again, it's that that wholesome sense towards life as such, that where they don't see any sort of distinguishing line between their activism, between their writing, between their art, between their poetry, between whatever creative pursuits they're doing. So people from nature writing, from anthropology, from the humanities, and from the hills, these would be my core. Yeah,
It
inspiration.
wasn't so long.
It was thank you. Yeah.
What also got my attention was that you have also made creative forays into music and photography. Where did that come from? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of, I don't know. Is it? I think we were talking earlier about individuals having different kinds of sensibilities, but also these sensibilities can come from, I mean, do come from human interaction.
Yes.
As well.
Absolutely.
So, it's not something necessarily inherent that, one is artsy or one
Yeah.
is, something else.
Yeah.
So, what about photography? Is it something you, again, nature and photography, I think, sort of go together. Music, I'm not so sure. You actually have to,
Yeah. Well,
I will not say you don't have to learn photography, but
oh,
I don't know. Music seems harder. I mean,
yeah. Well, so in second or third last line that you said, yeah, I'm quite suspicious of people when they say that oh, he's completely talented or it's an inherent kind of a thing. The great writer James Baldwin has this line saying that talent is overrated. What ultimately matters are the old-fashioned idols of discipline, perseverance, hard work, all of that. Which basically means that anyone can become talented over time as well. Having said that, I'll again go back to the Himalayas and my mother, because they were the part of, and once you find these two big inspirations literally within the perimeter of your household, you think it's all natural. But of course, it's a privilege to have that kind of a guidance. So as I was saying, her attention towards the ordinary in extraordinary terms was something that made me also quite enchanted towards कि यदि आप कुकिंग कर रहे हैं तो इसमें ये मसाला जाना चाहिए और इसको ऐसे तरीके से तैयार करना चाहिए या घर को ऐसे रखना चाहिए या पढ़ाना ऐसे चाहिए in the class and all. Even when she would be teaching a particular lesson in the classroom, she would make it sure that whatever objects or ideas or artifacts that were connected with that lesson would be shown. So I think this was how I started thinking about my passion and hobbies as well. This inherent interdisciplinarity of it. The Himalayas are always presenting you with glorious canvases, so invariably, if you have a phone camera or whatever, you do end up becoming, it's appreciative.
But you do not paint.
I don't paint. I don't
Thank
paint.
God.
I don't paint. My mother paints. I don't paint. My brother is also an excellent a miniaturist. Actually, he draws. So I think both of them have taken care of that department, and I don't. I try to sketch, but I'm very bad in that. Photography, however, is something. This is the art of framing. It's also something that helps you just record the everyday. So when I think it was only when I went to Cambridge for the first time, and there was this completely other world around me, and I had a small pocket camera, and I would just keep clicking and all. But interestingly, there too, Shimla had a role to play, because in Cambridge, I was encountering an architecture that I had already encountered in Shimla, which was the British architecture. So I was finally in a place which served as the real inspiration for the fantastical architecture of Shimla, right? And then going back to Shimla would remind me of Cambridge, to the extent that a couple of my exhibitions were just about drawing these parallels between, a British photograph and a Shimla photograph. So actually place these two photographs together and ask my viewers and all, what do you think about it, and that kind of a cross-cultural dialogue. Music has been a fundamental part of my life, and I think of everyone's life in some ways. After food, if there's one thing that I think sustains me, and if I just have to pick up one thing, it would always be music. The great 19th century aesthete Walter Pater once said that music aspires towards the conditions of all art aspires towards the conditions of music, meaning that every art form ultimately aims to become musical in some or the other way, and that definition has sort of stayed with me. The One of my other inspirations is the Bollywood director Sanjay Leela Bhansali, who's both a musician and and a visual person. And in many of his interviews, he says that even before he goes on to direct films, he thinks about the soundtrack and then ends up sort of directing it. And that sense of sound being the, what should I say, the generator of imagination is something very, very close to my heart. I was talking about Tim Ingold, and in one of his anthropological works, he has this beautiful line where he says that with vision, you're always at the edge of things. So you can only see what is there in front of you a little bit sideways. But with sound, you're always in things. So you can always hear. And there is therefore some kind of a totality that sound and music has that is not necessarily there in photography, as much as I would claim myself to be first a photographer and then a musician. And Ma has been a folk singer, so I have grown up listening to Himachali folk songs all my life, and then I picked up the piano. I've never learned music. I don't know how to read.
You're
or
not
write
good
this.
formal.
Never. I don't know how to read or write music, even though I was a part of the choir at Cambridge. So even when they used to have these big, big sheets and all, it would all be Greek to me because I would just be singing. And I compose just by ear.
Played by ear.
And I know I'm going round and round, but I'll to end this thing, I think my biggest inspiration remains the landscape. If there is a way I feel in which all folk music is ultimately the music of the landscape, So for instance, when Tagore went to the UK to study law, and he didn't do that, but he ended up listening and collecting a lot of music from Ireland and Britain, and then using some of those tunes for his Rabindra Sangeet, which eventually passed down through Satyajit Ray and Vidhu Vinod Chopra and all of that. And I'm fascinated by the fact that someone so rooted like him in India is able to find these parallels between folk tunes of Bengal and all. There's a certain openness of mind, and there's a certain openness of landscape as well, right? These vast
You adopt and you do not give up what is yours, and
you don't. Absolutely.
yeah.
And I think that's what, I'm nowhere am I comparing or placing myself there, but I'm just saying that there is a way in which landscape, geography, and imagination of different cultures ends up sort of being embodied within you.
Fusion, I'm not sure fusion is the right word to capture. Yes, kind of, connectedness.
I'm not sure either that I'm talking about fusion exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm not very critical of it either. It's okay if some people want to sort of bring together those things, but I think it's just a certain correspondence between sensibilities, which is happening through art. So yeah, it just feels natural. And if I don't, for instance, here, as much as I'm enjoying myself like anything in Goa and all, I don't have my keyboard or the piano with me, and after a while my fingers start feeling very jittery because I have not been on that. So I think the first thing I'll do once I go back, just play a tune and like sort of it will get it out of me. But yeah, that's it's just a part of me. And again, I don't think of my critical and creative interests as separate. They form a part of the continuum, and I think that's where the joy of life also resides.
So this is your last week in Goa, and I was wondering, what next?
Well, lots of projects.
And let's just. I hope it's not a bunch of things that you're doing, because that
No. It is that it has always a bunch.
that becomes overwhelming, sort of, just to know about.
Well, first aim is to just finish this book, which is a very, very big book, and I'm hoping it finishes in the next 1 year, at least the writing part of it. I know the publication requires time and all, and I have been researching this for a very long time. So just have to put a stop somewhere,
Yeah.
because the moment you go back to Shimla, I end up finding 2 more new things.
Good book is a done book.
It's a
Right.
exactly, and then it's always an incomplete book
Yeah.
as well. But anyway, I have to do it. You're right, actually. So that's the first thing. I'm also editing a particular volume in Himachal Pradesh as part of this series called the Indian Expression series. It's being mentored by Professor G.N. Devi, the great cultural theorist and linguist who also helmed the People's Linguistic Survey of India. And they are trying to bring out these 35, 36 volumes relating to every state and union territory, where they are bringing together essays and chapters related to the art and culture of each region post 1947. So that's I'm the editor of.
He's a remarkable.
He's a fantastic.
He has been here
Absolutely.
a couple of times, I think,
wow.
for the Lit Fest. So has had the honor of
His
meeting.
So I never met him. I mean, I envy you, and I really hope I can meet him someday. But I think it's a fantastic project to bring together everything. One is that, another is a book on the Kangra Valley, where my mother comes from, and which is a place I mean, I've been going there because my Nana Nani used to live there, and they're no longer alive. But it's a place I ended up appreciating much more after my return from Cambridge. Unlike Shimla, that is a pre-colonial part of Himachal. So despite the colonial influences and all, it's a valley and all, and it's a whole world in itself. It's the music from the Kangra Valley that I have grown up with, and the more I go back, the more I listen to all of that and observe. And the Kangra School of Art also comes from there, the miniature school. I see that there's a lot to be researched there. So that's one. And finally, a book on Bansali's cinema, which I was talking about as well, which is an interdisciplinary project, not entirely a work of film criticism, but a kind of meditation on aesthetics, craft, culture, cinema, and heritage, as seen through his and then through my lens, inspired from his lens. So I must thank Goa for sort of forwarding that project as well, because his first film Kamushi and his sixth film Guzarish were both set in Goa. And before coming here, I really told myself that I finally get to see the city which I saw in his film first, and it ended up inspiring my photographs of that place as well. So even though I am supposed to be working only on my Shimla project, in a way the residency has already helped me with my future projects as well. So that's it. That's all.
Okay, here's an idea, if I may. Yes. Right? I mean, if you're writing a book on Shimla, and right, this was just mentioned in passing earlier, that one can think of Mussoorie, one can think of Dehradun, Nainital. I mean, you could actually do a book on these hill stations of North India.
Yes.
All of them were in different ways, served as lesser summer outposts for the British. I'm not sure about what was there earlier. All of them are also tied to some of the most well-established old schools in the country. Dehradun, Nainital, Shimla too, right? I mean,
Absolutely. BCS, Bishop Cotton School, Jesus and Mary, Loreto Convent, all of that. Yeah.
So, I mean, that could be something you could consider, because just as an aside, because one of the things that you have in academia, and this is I don't remember who told me this story. Somebody said, no, look, you can work on one theme and then keep working on that and become a master of, when somebody says, this person worked in the area of aesthetics. So you have a range of writing on various aspects of aesthetics.
Totally.
So that's one way to do it. The other way is, okay, I did aesthetics, now nothing doing, I'm on to something next. But Shimla really, I mean, the book on Shimla really made me think that, are there books on these hill stations of North India? And there is a pre-independence part to it. There is a post-independence part of it. Some of it maybe go back even further. But that is something I thought would be very, very interesting for lots of people, unless there is already some good writing on there.
No, absolutely. You told me to keep my answer short, so I didn't talk about this one. But this has been there since the last 10 years, actually. This would be a very big project, to be honest. And so what I'm doing in my Shimla work is, in fact, in the last 10 years, I have been traveling to other hill stations just to develop a solid comparative perspective within my mind as well, right? So those references would come within this book most definitely. Like Darjeeling was quite similar to Shimla when I went there, and yet not. I mean, I have always been very critical of Shimla as well, especially after the haphazard development and all of that. But once I started going to, and I don't know if this is politically correct or not, once I started going to all other hill stations, my respect towards Shimla just increased many fold times because I was like, it's still maintaining some part of its heritage or some part of its, like history and all, in a way where other places are not.
No, they're losing.
And they're very much losing. Even Shimla is losing for that matter. But just the sheer grandness in topography helps it, retain some part of its, whatever you want to call it, originality or whatever it is. I've been to Matharan, I've been to Uti, Mussoorie, Nainital I'm yet to visit, Darjeeling. So these have definitely given me a kind of a comparative perspective, which I would like to weave in within this book itself. And then, yes, later on, perhaps, if not necessarily a textual history, then perhaps a visual history as well, because I have a plethora of photographs, given that I am a photographer. So that might be another way of, bringing all of these things together. So that's very much there in my mind. And I'll never tire of Highlands and I'll never tire of aesthetics. I don't think so. Can't.
Okay. Thank you,
you.
Siddharth. Thank you so
so-
much for
thank
taking
you,
the time
Pushkar.
to join us, and it's been wonderful chatting.
It's a huge privilege for me as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.